very proud. We scattered the enemy.
The hard hats were heroes for a few days, praised by Wall Street workers, given free coffee by area luncheonette owners. The leaders of the construction unions were invited to the White House, where they presented President Nixon with an honorary hard hat. And the hard hat became a symbol for the so-called silent majority, those who felt their way of life was now under siege. By the early 1970s, it wasn't just anti-Vietnam protesters on the streets and on the news anymore, but a dizzying array of other forces as well. Women, Native Americans, Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, Black Panthers, Gray Panthers, the openly gay Pink Panthers. All these groups, forged in this era of so-called identity politics, were all militantly demanding their rights. The backlash against this politics of protest was just about ready to explode. An event in September of 1971 hastened the eruption. When 1,500 prison inmates rioted and demanded their rights, the nation's anger and frustration became focused on the Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York. The inmates captured 50 hostages, took control of the prison's D-yard, and issued what they called 5 non-negotiable demands.
Wait a minute, hold it.
New York Times reporter Tom Wicker was one of the outside observers the inmates called on to help negotiate the non-negotiable.
The Attica inmates revolted basically against internal prison conditions. But the rhetoric of the revolt was very Marxist. You know, the oppressed peoples of the world arise.
The entire incident that has erupted here at Attica is a result of the unmitigated oppression brought by the racist administrative network of this prison.
As this tense real-life drama unfolded, families of the hostages, desperate for word on the condition of their husbands or fathers or brothers, clustered around the prison.
Would you take that? Would you take the mic out?
They saw Black Panther leader Bobby Seale come to visit the inmates. They heard that North Vietnam offered the rioters asylum. Attica quickly became a symbol for all of America's boiling hatreds.
I went outside the prison to report on what was happening inside. And all of a sudden there began to be these shouts and screams from the crowd. I hope they kill you all, that sort of thing. They identified us, the observers, with the inmates.
The tensions mounted as neither side seemed willing to make concessions, and the state ready to take the prison back by force. On the morning of the revolt's 4th day, prison officials did not let the observers back into D-yard. Armed state troopers were perched on the prison walls.
Everybody got a gas mask.
And certainly those scared young troopers thought the inmates were going to kill the hostages. So they came in scared, they came in shooting, they came in taking no chances.
The hostages are on the catwalks with knives at their throats.
The 4-day standoff ended in 9 minutes of mayhem. Helicopters dropped CS gas on D-yard and state police marksmen opened fire, killing 29 inmates and 10 hostages.
It's crazy, they didn't have to do that. If the state had just sat there for 2 more weeks, maybe 3 at the outside, I mean, those guys would have given up.
Your hands on top of your head and move to the outside of the D block corridor.
What is it now, 20-odd years later? I can't get over that feeling. They didn't have to do that, you know, but they did.
What happened at Attica was the largest and deadliest attack on Americans by other Americans since the Civil War. And in 1971, it often looked as though the country was in the middle of another civil war.
I'm just like most of the guys I would say in Vietnam, I'm just going to do my time and get out of here if I can. I'm not here to win a war. I'm just here to do my time and rotate. How short am I? How much time do I have left? That's the biggest concern of everyone. And can I make it?
The war was not going to be won. It was just going to be exited in the best possible political manner. And it was about dog eat dog and surviving. Really a very brutal, prison-like existence of survival.
Inside, that really eats away at you. That has a tremendous negative effect on your spirit and your sense of worth and your sense of purpose. You know, I was tired of all of it, weary of it. And too many deaths and too much pain and too much suffering.
By 1970, American troops left in Vietnam felt the country was abandoning the war and them. The number of American ground forces had been cut in half as part of President Nixon's pledge to win peace with honor. As the pullout continued, new recruits, overwhelmingly draftees, felt they were being asked to fight a war already lost on the battlefield and despised at home. The enemy had no doubt about its purpose. Its only way out of the war was victory or death.
Unlike American soldiers who came to Vietnam and they came only for 1 year and then got out, in Vietnam there was no draft period like 1 or 2 years. So you would go on to the end of the day, to the end of the war.
They were tough, and they proved it. When the trails were bombed, they would carry all of their gear on their back, they would hump it for days. They were fighting for home, which is something I wasn't doing. When you're fighting for home, you get down.
As American ground forces were being cut back, air attacks were being stepped up in an effort to pound concessions out of the enemy.
We had to rely on caves and tunnels and underground bunkers to defend us because the B-52 is a terrible high-tech. If you see half of the long bomb like this, then we know for sure that it would go to another place. But when you look up and you see a round bomb like this, it means that it's right on you.
But continuous rounds of bombing and hundreds of thousands of casualties did little to deter an adversary continuously resupplied by China and the Soviet Union, and able to recruit seemingly endless numbers of people.
It is truly a national mobilization in that all people, men and women, young children, took part in the national effort of war. We saw an escalation of the anti-war movement all over the world, and even in America. We heard about the killing of the student in Kent State and everything. The news from the anti-war movement all over the world gave us strength.
Walt Kurtz, Tennessee, 4 Bronze Stars.
Right on.
In America by the early 70s, protesters against the war included some of the men who had fought in it. Once eager soldiers who now felt lied to and betrayed.
I pray that time will forgive me and my brothers what we did.
I wasn't in Washington where they threw their medals. I thought I'd try to do one better, and I sent my campaign ribbons to President Nixon. I saw the war as completely unwinnable, which made it even worse, even more criminal. Go on fighting a war that you know you can't and won't win. It struck me as worse than criminal. It struck me as insanity.
As the war dragged on into the 10th year of American military involvement, there was still no end in sight. Vietnam had already brought down one president and was now threatening to bring down another. President Nixon's standing in the polls dropped severely as the promise of peace with honor proved elusive. Peace talks in Paris with the North Vietnamese were stalled over the concept of mutual withdrawal and the release of American prisoners of war. Secret negotiations between National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and Lee Dak-to were not making any progress. But in February of 1972, another set of secret negotiations did lead to one of the biggest diplomatic coups of the 20th century. In one stunning swoop, the Cold War politics of the post-war era changed. America was recognizing and dealing with the communists.
Nixon was the great anti-communist, and to come on national television and announce that I've been invited to China and I've accepted with pleasure, it was astonishing. And you could tell by the reaction of the press.
White House aide Patrick Buchanan was on the trip the president called the week that changed the world.
We have at times in the past been enemies. We have great differences today.
He went to Beijing, frankly, because he was trying to work the foreign policy game to get the United States out of Vietnam with honor.
Nixon's aim was to have the Chinese pressure their North Vietnamese allies to come to terms at the peace table. And just 4 months after China, Richard Nixon became the first American president to visit Moscow, where he and Leonid Brezhnev signed the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. The president got something else as well.
He wanted Mao and Zhou Enlai in Beijing to have sleepless nights wondering what's Nixon talking to Brezhnev about over there in Moscow tonight. And he was a genius at this. And putting those tensions on, which had the effect of blocking Soviet or Chinese getting together to present a united front against the United States in Vietnam.
Nixon had taken a calculated chance, and it had worked. The Soviet Union cared more about getting controls on American offensive missiles and preventing the Americans from broadening and thickening an anti-ballistic missile system than they did about their little allies in North Vietnam, who were getting the living hell bombed out of them.
And there was a sense of being betrayed, sold off, at that time by the superpowers.
No longer able to depend on their powerful allies, the North Vietnamese appeared ready to make concessions at the peace talks. In October of 1972, there was an announcement from the National Security Advisor.
We believe that peace is at hand.
A month later, President Nixon, now seen as a seasoned world statesman, was re-elected in a landslide. But by December, peace was still not at hand. The North Vietnamese had left the negotiations, and President Nixon ordered the bombing of Hanoi and the port of Haiphong to force them back. For 11 days, American B-52s pounded Hanoi with 40,000 tons of bombs.
Hanoi was in rubble. The railroads, the bridges were all down. They had selected targets, obviously, and the U.S. knew where we were. And the only thing that happened in the POW camp was a piece of plaster fell down, and it hit one of the POWs in the head and cut his head. That's the only injury throughout that whole bombing.
Bob Jones was in Hanoi during the Christmas bombings. He was one of 500 American prisoners of war held in a prison they called the Hanoi